All right, so this is Wednesday's review video, summary of what we are doing today in class, and of course some of you don't have class until tomorrow on Thursday. But what we did today is basically think a little bit more deeply about the conflict myth, because as you'll remember yesterday, we spent time kind of introducing how one might compare worldviews to one another. We had these 6 ways that we might think through comparing worldviews, deciding which one was more trustworthy in the end. And after we did that, we thought about there being really kind of 3 roadblocks to our conversation if we're going to try to compare and contrast worldviews, especially between scientific naturalism and theism. It's going to be problematic because it's in a postmodern world. That makes it hard. We don't really like telling people we think they're wrong. We don't really like having to defend our own beliefs. We like everyone just to have their own beliefs and everyone be happy. That's one roadblock to the conversation. The second roadblock that we arrived at is at the bottom of this page now. It's scientism, this over-reliance and excessive belief in the power of science. It becomes a roadblock in this conversation, trying to compare the worldviews of scientific naturalism versus theism. And then the third is this conflict myth, which we talked about, right? Where there is this belief that historically and fundamentally, faith and science are in conflict with one another. So what we did today is try to evaluate, where did this conflict myth come from? And if I were to identify 5 places that I think are important for the generation or the genesis of the conflict myth, I would say these are the 5. First, the Enlightenment thinkers, men like Voltaire and Gibbons and Rousseau, were insistent that really the church and Christian faith had held back progress in world history and was responsible for even the Dark Ages and was in conflict with science all throughout history. Secondly, if you look in the 19th century or the 1800s, you can find several people who were insistent that the world would be better off, America would be better off if it's secularized, if society became more and more secular, less and less people having faith, our institutions becoming more purposefully secular. Guys like Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper were academics, and they wanted their universities to become more secular. So they wrote books trying to show that Christianity was a problem for intellectual pursuits and that historically science and faith had not gotten along, and so we have to get rid of faith so that we can do science. And so they wrote books like Andrew Dixon White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Religion in Christendom. Now, to be sure, in their books and in the Enlightenment thinkers, they would arrive at some historical mistakes of the church, things we have to admit to and be honest about. Maybe the one that it shows up the most is the episode with Galileo. Clearly, Galileo is doing science, and clearly the church is interrupting his science. Now, it's actually a very complex episode and not really very well understood. I'm tempted to go into great depth here, but we don't necessarily need to. What we do need to understand is this, that any anecdotal argument is flawed. If someone is trying to tell me that science and faith are at odds because look what happened to Galileo, what they're doing is they're giving me an anecdote. They're using a particular story to try to prove a point. But the flaw in that is that we can't tell for certain if this anecdote that I'm being given is the exception or the rule. If you give me a single anecdote, there's no real argumentation there. It's an appeal to emotion. It is a piece of evidence, but may not be indicative of the larger story. And so while the church has made mistakes in regards to its relationship with science, I think that those mistakes are the exception rather than the rule, and I hope to demonstrate that at some point. Fourth, I think a much bigger issue for us in the American church has been this emphasis on faith being blind and being somewhat anti-intellectual. To be sure, if we look out through the history of Christianity in America in the 20th century, we will find plenty of people advocating for what is now called fideism. Fideism is a term that's meant to describe someone who says that belief or faith should be blind, that if it has evidence, it's somehow less virtuous, less faith-oriented. And this led, I think, to Christian churches sort of abandoning academia. There are plenty of sociologists and historians who have traced this particular problem. Maybe most famously is Mark Knoll of Notre Dame. He wrote a book about the evangelical church, especially in the 20th century, that will talk about his thesis. But he basically argues that the people in the church in the United States in the 20th century purposefully abandoned intellectual pursuits, believing that they would somehow be undermining their faith if they pursued intellectual rigor. That's a harvest that we're still reaping, and it's a real big problem. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit too. I actually posted a reading in the channels today that's meant to help us understand that and what the problems with that are. And lastly, it's something called methodological atheism. We will deal with this the least out of all of these 5, but it will come up. And basically it's this idea that if you're a scientist, you should approach your science with the assumption that there are natural explanations for the phenomenon that you are studying and investigating. And while that may actually be a sort of good approach, it doesn't necessarily follow that all causes are natural, or that there is no supernatural. This is something that we'll look at when we're actually evaluating the work of Stephen Hawking and his book, The Grand Design, as we're talking about one particular argument for God's existence called the cosmological argument. So we will try to evaluate. You'll notice each of these we're going to have to think about, like, okay, do these Enlightenment thinkers and the way they construct history, is this correct? Is the work of the 19th century secularists, is it trustworthy work? Or maybe do their motivations sort of paint their product a little bit a bias? We've got to ask ourselves about the mistakes of the Christian church, and and beyond that, ask ourselves what a good argument in response might look like. Fourth, of course, we have to ask ourselves what faith means, whether faith and reason can complement one another. And I think that we can demonstrate biblically and philosophically that they do, in fact, complement one another. Lastly, we're going to have to ask ourselves, where did science come from? Is it necessarily atheistic? And the clear historical truth is no, it's not. It's not atheistic as an institution, as a method of thinking, and it was actually born out of Christian theology, which I hope I'll be able to demonstrate. In the meantime, what we did today is we thought about the Enlightenment in terms of their concept of history, and we made a line graph. And what I want you to imagine is that this line graph going left to right here is time, the progress of time, moving from prehistory through the classical age all the way up to today. And on the left, the y-axis here, is human understanding or progress. And what we noted is the fact that many Enlightenment thinkers would have kind of conceptualized history this way. They would have said, during prehistory, we had very little understanding. And then, of course, as we move up through the classical age, our understanding improves with the Greeks and the Romans. Then, as the church gains power, what ends up happening is our human understanding of the world around us plunges. Remember guys like Dawkins who say that faith makes you accept and embrace not understanding the world around us. And many of the Enlightenment thinkers thought the same way. They said, yes, the Dark Ages are a result of the church, a result of what the church did to inhibit progress and plunged us into this very difficult time period. And they would say, but thankfully we have this Renaissance and Enlightenment, and you might say scientific revolution that brings us up out of the pit, out of the Dark Ages, and sets us on our way towards what we might think of as a secular age. Their thesis included the belief that eventually the world would become entirely secular, that as we understood more and more about the world around us, we would believe or have less and less faith. They believed that eventually the future was entirely secular. Now here's the problem with this thesis. It's actually incorrect. While there are bits and pieces to support their way of thinking, in the end, it does not work. It's not a powerful explanation for the way history actually is. For instance, if we looked at the classical age, we would notice some impressive things, to be sure, but we would also notice some really troubling things about human progress. Ideas like human rights were not being honored, and people were being trampled underfoot by the elites. Equality was really not widely distributed. It was not as good a time period as people think. If you study the Greeks and Romans, what you realize is actually there's this underbelly, this really, really dark history going on there. Beyond that, if we look at the Dark Ages, we find out while there's some darkness here, some difficult things happening like the plagues or what have you, in fact, it's an era of tremendous progress in terms of technology and understanding and philosophy, and universities are being established. It's really, in the end, actually a continuation of human progress and understanding. And so to call them the Dark Ages is actually incorrect. Even if your history book tells you that this is the Dark Ages, if you investigated it, if you really studied it, if you really researched, you would find that this era was an era of tremendous progress of human understanding. Then, if we looked at the Renaissance era and the Enlightenment era, we would certainly find some really good moments, some things that they say that are correct, and they are impressive intellects. These people we're talking about, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these are impressive people. But we have to understand that the way they have portrayed themselves is painting our understanding of them. They named themselves the Enlightenment. They called their own era the Enlightenment. And we have to ask, what is maybe the impact of that? Maybe their bias towards their own perspective and their own understanding has painted their way of describing history, of synthesizing history, in a way that damages it overall. Lastly, and easiest to demonstrate as incorrect is the secularization thesis. Remember, they believed that as history went on, the world would become less and less religious. While it is true to say there are certain areas of the world that have become less religious than they were once upon a time, Europe, North America, to be sure, are moving towards what we might call post-Christian cultures. But the Southern Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere has actually grown significantly in terms of religious belief. Places like China, which had actually tried to eradicate faith, even the Soviet Union, places like that had tried to eradicate faith. What happened instead is that faith came back. It's hard to explain why, but almost inexplicably, faith came back as those more totalitarian governments relaxed restrictions on expressions of faith. The world has not become more secular. America has perhaps become more secular, but not the world. A higher percentage of people claim faith in the world today than 100 years ago. And it is true to say now that sociologists have largely abandoned the secularization thesis. In the end, it's a failed thesis. Even people who were huge proponents of it before have now agreed that in the end, it's not what came to take place. Even though the Enlightenment thinkers anticipated it happening, even though Karl Marx and Emil Durkheim and Sigmund Freud and Max Weber all said, yeah, the world's going to get more secular, it didn't happen. And moreover, the idea that education would somehow make the world better in and of itself is also a failed aspect of that thesis. The most educated country in the world, for instance, 70 years ago or 80 years ago, was Germany. Had the best universities and the most thoroughly educated population, and yet they plunged into fascism, and they plunged into a very dark time of Nazi rule over that country. And this is something that actually Sigmund Freud even had to have pause about, because he was so sure that education and secularization was going to bring about a better world, and that really damaged his thinking quite a bit. So anyway, as we evaluate the genesis of the conflict myth, I think we're going to find over and over that there is, in the end, no real conflict between faith and science. This is just one piece of evidence. The Enlightenment thesis of conflict actually fails upon further review. Let me know if you need anything.